The year is 1603. In Richmond Palace, heavy velvet curtains block the dawn's light, as if trying to prevent the sun from witnessing the twilight of a myth. Inside that silent chamber lies the most powerful woman England ever knew, Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. Her body, wrapped in royal red fabrics, looks like a fallen idol. What was once a theatrical face covered in white powder and intense rouge now crumbles into a waxy, pale, and lifeless mask. Her cracked lips bleed in small dark threads, and her eyes, which once commanded armies and made ambassadors tremble, now look at nothing. The royal physicians approach with leaden steps. No autopsy has been authorized, for monarchs are not opened up like the bodies of common mortals. However, rumors are already circulating through the court. They speak of her refusal to eat, to sleep, to speak. They speak of endless nights when she stood in the center of her room, her eyes fixed on an invisible void, as if listening to voices no one else could perceive. Some whisper that she has gone mad. Others murmur the word poisoning, a dangerous word in a palace where every gesture is politics and every silence can be a sentence. The air is heavy with a pungent odor, incense, cold sweat, expensive perfume that can no longer cover the stench emanating from her skin. One of her most loyal servants confesses in a low voice that the queen screams at the slightest touch, that she shudders as if her body were a field of hidden wounds. Others recall her strange phrases in Latin, half prayers, half riddles, which left everyone with a chill down their spine. The woman who had dominated the European political stage, who had confronted the Pope and humiliated the invincible Armada, now consumes herself before their eyes like a candle in its last breath. But what no one dares to say aloud is that this white mask, carefully constructed with lead paste, was much more than an adornment of vanity. It was a wall, a disguise, an instrument of power. For more than 40 years, Elizabeth did not show the world her true face. The makeup not only hid wrinkles and scars, it hid the vulnerability of a woman turned into a divine symbol. In Protestant England, her body did not belong to her. It was the incarnation of God's victory over Rome, the visible face of an expanding empire. The lead that slowly devoured her also kept her intact in the eyes of the people. A cruel irony. The very substance that gave her the appearance of marble was destroying her cell by cell. Like a Faustian pact, Elizabeth accepted the condemnation in order to continue reigning with the illusion of eternal youth. Because abandoning that mask would have been admitting that the queen was flesh and blood, that she could fall ill, that she could die. And in a world where power was sustained by the fiction of the monarch's incorruptible body, that truth was simply unacceptable. While the candles crackle, casting deformed shadows on the dark wooden walls, the advisors argue behind closed doors. What is worse for the kingdom, the death of the queen, or the revelation of her true appearance? The silence weighs more than any decree. The entire court understands that if the subjects knew what hides beneath the paint and silks, the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty would collapse like a poorly built stage. What lies in that bed is not just a dying woman, it is England's best-kept secret, a secret that threatens to drag an entire empire down with it. First, they loosen the corset. The laces, tightened for decades like a cage of bone and whalebone, give way with a harsh lament. The air in the chamber thickens. A sweetish, putrid smell, a mixture of stale sweat, rancid ointments, and the metallic trace of vinegar. The maids bring warm cloths, the doctors leather gloves. Officially, there is no autopsy, only preparations for the funeral majesty. But everyone understands that, by removing each layer, they will not only undress the queen, they will dismantle a 40-year fiction. Under the silk, the skin does not look like skin. It is mottled with blacks and greens, like fruit forgotten in a cellar. Blisters that have burst and closed again. Recent scabs, older ones. Areas hardened like old leather, and soft areas that ooze. Where the corset compressed the sternum, the flesh shows a map of brown bruises. Under the shoulders, a relief of perpetual cracks and chafing. One of the doctors crosses himself without thinking, a Catholic gesture in a Protestant court. Another steps back with trembling hands. No one utters the word, but everyone smells it. Rot. They attack the face as if it were an altar. The lead white, ceruse, is not removed. It peels off. The damp cloths loaded with aromatic water soften the toxic paste, and it falls in long strips, like wallpaper peeling off a damp wall. Behind it there is no alabaster, nor lily, nor moon. There are purplish spots, blackish areas where circulation gave up, fine cracks that cross like dry rivers. The hairline has receded to an unnatural height, exposing a scalp dotted with lesions. Where portraits promised eternity, the evidence proclaims an unappealable biological truth. The beauty was chemical, and the chemistry took its toll. The inventory of instruments on the table is a catalog of courtly self-deception, fine hairbrushes, powders crushed in mortars, thick perfumes, whitish pomades, vinegar to set the makeup. Years of daily application have turned the cosmetics into a second dermis. The ceruse, basic lead carbonate, gave Elizabeth the icy glow demanded by the court's canon. Marble purity, sacred distance. It also delivered to her, drop by drop, a slow death. Headaches, tremors, insomnia, irritability, hallucinations, tissue destruction. The mask was not a gesture of coquetry, it was a political system. Every morning the queen reappeared before the kingdom with the renewed surface of the unalterable. Every night the toxicity advanced one step further toward her core. There are private letters, doctor's notes, veiled warnings. She knew it. She knew that lead bites slowly like an endless winter. And yet she chose the ritual. Out of vanity? Yes, but not only that. In a world where the monarch's body is a metaphor for the body of the state, the slightest tremor in the epidermis can be read as a fissure in the crown. A pimple is a bad omen. A pustule, a presage, a wrinkle, a heresy against the eternity of the dynasty. It is no coincidence that Protestant England elevated the face of its queen to a secular liturgical icon. An altar without a sacrament, but with dogma. The dogma was absolute white, and dogmas, as is known, never accept cracks. As the layers fall, the technique of the illusion is revealed. Over a base of oily ointments, the ceruse was applied. On top, rouge with cinnabar. To seal it, scented powders that disguise the metallic smell. The eyebrows thinned to a suggestion, the hair powdered to pale it, the neck extended by the corset to an almost hieratic tightness. It was not just makeup, it was architecture. The face had to sustain the fiction of a sovereignty outside of time. The torso, the verticality that represses the fall. The entire court was complicit in that scaffolding. Painters who embellish, poets who canonize, ambassadors who pretend not to see. The contrast with the anatomical reality is brutal. Where the paint proclaimed symmetry, the muscle yields. Where the oil drew smoothness, the skin oozes. One of the doctors, with clinical coldness, notes that the texture of the cheek resembles damp parchment. Another suggests suspending the washing for fear of tearing. Someone asks, almost in a whisper, if it is advisable to reconstruct the countenance for the final parade. The answer is political, not medical. The people must not see. For them, the queen will remain the portrait, a luminous sheet, an undefeated gaze. Death, like illness, belongs to secrecy. And yet Elizabeth's intimate logic is understood all too well. It was not solely about sustaining beauty. It was about sustaining the symbol that had rescued her from the original fragility of her sex in a misogynistic Europe. While her enemies invoked Eve and her guilt, Elizabeth invented an alternate archetype, the Virgin of State, not the Virgin Mother, but the sovereign virgin, untouchable, intact, a political statue. The ceruse fixed that statue every morning. The statue returned obedience, tributes, ships, treaties, victories. In exchange, it demanded a silent sacrifice, the flesh. There is a psychological dimension that beats beneath the chemistry. The mask prolongs the self that power needs, a skin of state that cushions the panic of expiration. Whoever has reigned as a constellation cannot allow the sky to show clouds. That is why the maids learn a lexicon of denials. There is no wound, there is no smell, there is no crack. In that vocabulary, denial is a method of government. If nothing is named, nothing exists. If nothing exists, Nothing threatens. A rumor crosses the room. Stop. An advisor proposes leaving a thicker trail of paint on the cheekbones and forehead for the closed wake in case someone from the nobility demands a final look. Another replies that the embalming and the lead coffin will make contemplation unnecessary. It is decided off the record that the queen will be remembered as an image, not as a body. The image, after all, has governed better than any army. And the image, white, immaculate, weightless, must survive its owner, even if it means erasing the evidence under gallons of silence. When they remove the last strip of paint, what remains is neither a monster nor a saint. It is an exhausted woman whose epidermal biography tells more history than any court chronicle. Lead, the invisible agent of the Renaissance, has pronounced its verdict. The mirror that obeyed yesterday accuses today. As the candles shorten their wicks, the dark chamber finally understands the paradox. The mask made the rain possible. The rain demanded the mask. And so what sustained the myth was also what bled it dry. On the way out, one of the doctors murmurs, "It is unknown whether with compassion or fear, that tomorrow when the procession crosses London, the city will see a statue pass inside another statue. The body enclosed in lead, and the lead enclosed in the legend." No one answers. On the table, the coagulated ceruse shines like dirty snow. There are things that history prefers to whitewash, but the skin, unappealable, has already told the truth. The official chronicles are silent. No record registers what happened in that chamber, because admitting it would have been to dynamite the architecture of the monarchy. But behind closed doors, with oaths of silence and death threats, the royal physicians ventured beyond what was permitted. They did so in whispers, as if the mere dissection of the queen amounted to the desecration of a temple. And what they found under the skin did not seem like the work of nature, but of a slow, poisoned alchemy. The liver, the central organ according to humoral theory, and a symbol of vitality and courage, lay hardened like a dark rock. It was not the moist and flexible mass they had palpated in other corpses. It was petrified coal, a fragment of black earth in the middle of the flesh. The kidneys, which in Galen's medicine purified the blood and regulated the body's balance, had turned into brittle sheets, thin as scorched parchment. One of the doctors held them between his gloved fingers and watched them crack like poorly fired glass. A sharp metallic smell filled the air. It was not the usual stench of death, but an acid that made the eyes water and burned the nostrils. Upon opening the abdominal cavity, a thick fluid emerged, dark as pitch, with a gelatinous texture that stuck to everything it touched. They tried to collect it in glass jars, but it clung to the leather gloves as if it had a will of its own. They called it the inner rot. Others linked it to black bile, one of the four humors whose abundance was associated with melancholy and madness. But what they had before them surpassed any ancient treatise. It was not an excess of humor. It was the invisible signature of a poison that the court knew and at the same time denied. Modern science offers a brutal diagnosis: chronic lead poisoning. Decades of inhaling powders, drinking from metal goblets, and applying lethal cosmetics had turned her body into a laboratory of internal corrosion. Lead not only deformed the skin, it also colonized the bones, displaced calcium, devastated the nervous system, and poisoned organs. The queen had been slowly devoured from the inside until her physiology became a ruin. But in 1603, no one could utter that explanation. The doctors were trapped between two worlds, that of the humors inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, and the uncertain beginning of an empirical medicine that still lacked a chemical language. In their desperation, they invented metaphors: the wasting of the royal core, the internal curse, the stone of flesh. These poetic formulas concealed scientific impotence, but they also kept the sacred narrative intact. If the queen was falling apart, it was not due to human error, but by mysterious design. The paradox was clear. Elizabeth had turned her body into a theater of power, but the stage was collapsing in private. While her speeches at Tilbury or in Parliament rumbled like iron thunder, her viscera were already reduced to dust. The contrast is so brutal that today it is almost unbearable to imagine her. The voice that inflamed multitudes sprang from a corroded organism. The theatrical gestures hid tremors. The political victories were built upon a poisoned circulatory system. Here, the most sinister symbolic dimension is revealed. The monarch's body was always a metaphor for the body politic. If the liver, the seat of bravery, was petrified, did it not symbolize a kingdom rigid to the point of fragility? If the kidneys, the source of purification, were dry and broken, did it not hint at an empire incapable of renewing itself? If an unnameable fluid stuck to every surface, was it not a reflection of a social poison that corroded the certainties of Protestant England from within? The doctors understood this, although they would never write it down. That is why they sealed their notes. That is why they kept quiet under oath. That corpse was not just the end of a woman, it was the broken mirror of an entire system. Because if the Iron Queen could be reduced to twisted bones and stone viscera, then the fiction of divine power became a farce. And no monarchy survives if it is revealed as a farce to its subjects. One of the anonymous chroniclers dropped a lapidary phrase years later: Elizabeth did not die, she unraveled. An expression that summarizes the slow demolition of a body consumed by its own mask. The marble queen was, in reality, a pillar of salt crumbled by daily poison. Her body did not succumb all at once, but grain by grain, like sand slipping through fingers. And in that crumbling hides the most uncomfortable truth, that absolute power can also be a victim of its own illusion. The corset had done its job for decades, not only sculpting a perfect torso for the gaze of ambassadors and subjects, but also disciplining bones and muscles until they were deformed. When the doctors inspected Elizabeth's back, they discovered a spine that was no longer a spine. It curved to one side in a grotesque arch, as if the entire bone structure had been forcibly molded by years of whalebone armor and iron ribbons. It was not the body of a triumphant queen. It was the body of a prisoner inside her own image. The vertebrae protruded under the skin like knots in a rope. The dorsal muscles were atrophied, incapable of supporting the weight of a body that had been forced to remain upright, motionless, during endless ceremonies. The shoulders drooped unevenly, as if gravity had finally won the battle against royal pride. Under the chest, the ribs showed clear signs of brutal, long-term compression. Some twisted over others, some collapsed inward. It was like observing a twisted cage that had held a bird captive for far too long. But the most disturbing finding was not in the bones, but in the flesh. Near the left breast, just below the collarbone, the doctors found an ulcerated mass oozing pus and blood. The skin around it burned a fiery red, and the underlying tissue was decomposed. It was an old wound, too old to be accidental. It had been covered, bandaged in secret time and time again, perhaps by the Queen's own hands, without ever alerting her official doctors. In a time when any physical imperfection could be interpreted as a divine stain on the crown, Elizabeth hid that sore as if hiding a crime. Some speculated in private that it could be breast cancer, an invisible and incomprehensible enemy for the science of her time. Others thought of an abscess originating from an untreated infection, allowed to grow until it became a monster. The truth is that that wound represented more than a medical problem. It was a symbol of how the monarch, turned into a living myth, had been rotting in secret for years while showing herself invincible in public. The Iron Woman who harangued the soldiers at Tilbury was the same one who bled in silence under the silk. The paradox is cruel. The stronger she had to appear before the world, the more vulnerable she became in private. The corset, a sign of elegance and authority, was also a tool of slow torture. The embroidered fabrics, the pride of the court, were bandages of concealment. The Queen's own body became a battlefield where two irreconcilable realities clashed: the fragile flesh of the mortal and the immortal statue that England demanded. The courtly obsession with maintaining the sovereign's verticality had a political background. In every ceremony, Elizabeth's upright figure was a metaphor for the state: immutable, unbreakable, incorruptible. That is why her posture could not yield even if her bones twisted and her muscles gave up. Every inch of her deformed body was a sacrifice in the name of that fiction, and every secret sore was a reminder that the truth was rotting beneath the scenery. The doctors knew it, but they could not say it. A wound on the Queen's body was a wound on the body of the realm. To admit it was to admit that England itself was bleeding. Thus, as they bandaged that sore for the last time, They understood that they were not treating a patient. They were holding up the facade of an entire empire. What was hidden under the gauze was not just corrupt flesh, it was the most necessary political lie of their time. And here emerges the darkest reflection. How much pain can a body endure when it becomes a symbol? Elizabeth accepted the torment of the corset, the poison of the makeup, the silence of the illness, all to preserve the illusion of immortality. The price was her own flesh. The queen who defeated the Armada did not die from a swift blow, but from thousands of daily bindings that slowly unraveled her. In the secret examination, one of the doctors mentioned a finding so strange that it seemed more allegory than reality. Elizabeth's uterus was reduced to a shriveled fragment, wrinkled like old parchment, brittle to the touch, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding dead tissue. For the men of the 17th century who still interpreted the body through the prism of religion, that detail was a divine confirmation. The Virgin Queen had borne in her flesh the seal of her eternal chastity. Infertility was read not as a disease but as a sign of holiness. However, the modern gaze offers another interpretation, that atrophied uterus could be explained by an undiagnosed endocrine disorder, perhaps Turner syndrome, which affects female development and fertility. Some current doctors mention the possibility of Rokitansky syndrome, a congenital condition in which the reproductive system never fully forms. Others suggest premature ovarian failure or severe pituitary dysfunctions. In an era without knowledge of hormones or genetics, these diseases were invisible. But the truth is that Elizabeth's biology perhaps denied her the possibility of bearing children long before she declared herself the Virgin Queen. The unsettling question arises immediately. Was Elizabeth's virginity a political decision or an imposition of her body? Legend paints her as a heroine who rejected marriages to keep England free from foreign ties. But the reality could be darker. Perhaps she never had a choice. Perhaps the myth of the Virgin was not born of her will, but of a physiological impossibility that the court transformed into an ideological weapon. History turned a lack into a virtue, a void into a miracle. The politics of virginity was one of the pillars of her reign. On a continent marked by the clash between Catholicism and Protestantism, Elizabeth presented herself as the spouse of her people, intact, pure, consecrated to the nation as to a god. Portraits showed her with Marian symbols, pearls of purity, crescent moons, white lilies. She was the virgin without a child, the mother without maternity, the woman elevated by the denial of her sex. Thus she neutralized the misogynistic suspicion that a woman on the throne was a danger. Turned into a statue of chastity, Elizabeth became unassailable. But the psychological price was devastating. The myth that protected her also imprisoned her. Beneath the silken gold, the woman Elizabeth was erased. She could not love. She could not give birth. She could not confess fragility. Any crack in the Virgin's armor would have been interpreted as political treason. Her body, reduced to a symbol, was suffocated by the burden of being more than a woman. And every day of silence about her infertility fed a lie that could no longer be broken without crumbling the entire Tudor edifice. The doctors who observed that withered uterus knew they were seeing something they could never name in public. The entire kingdom needed to believe that the queen had chosen virginity as an act of sovereignty. To acknowledge that her body had made the decision for her would have been to admit that politics was built upon a biological weakness. And in 17th century Protestant England, weakness was heresy. The most unsettling thing is the resonance this finding still has. The myth of the Virgin persists as one of England's great national narratives. But beneath that myth beats the suspicion that it was all theater, that Elizabeth's political holiness was, in reality, the mask of a never-diagnosed illness. And that possibility, rather than aggrandizing her, humanizes her. The queen who seemed a goddess may have been a woman marked by a cruel biological destiny. Thus, the shriveled uterus found in secret was not just a medical detail. It was the symbolic heart of the Tudor enigma, the confirmation that the myth of the Virgin Queen was as much a political construction as an intimate tragedy. And that secret, buried under layers of ceremony and silence, continues to beat in the cold stone of Westminster like a wound that history still does not dare to open. Among the most unsettling whispers that circulated after Elizabeth's death was one that bordered on the unacceptable, the so-called legend of the Bisley Boy. According to this rumor, the real Elizabeth Tudor had died as a child, and to avoid the wrath of King Henry VIII, her tutors had replaced the princess with a local boy, trained in disguise to assume the role of the future queen. For centuries, this story was ridiculed as a tavern tale. But after the findings of 1603, some details began to fit the fable a little too well. Those attending the embalming allegedly noticed anomalous physical proportions: long limbs for her height, a broad rib cage, and unusually narrow hip bones. One servant whispered that the skeleton seemed more masculine than feminine. Others mentioned the absence of clear reproductive features, a silence that became a pact among those who witnessed it. None of this was officially recorded, but fragments of the rumor appeared in private letters and ciphered notes that survived court censorship. The iconography itself fuels the suspicion. In her later portraits, Elizabeth appears with a square jaw, a flat chest, and powerful shoulders. The delicacy of the young maiden transformed into an almost androgynous, ambiguous, and distant figure. Was it merely an artistic device to accentuate her majesty, or an unconscious reflection of a more disturbing reality? The sepulchral silence surrounding the preparation of her body lends more weight to the doubt than any official chronicle. The Bisley Boy hypothesis, though rejected by Orthodox historians, is fascinating because it touches the central nerve of power: identity. Does biological sex matter when the political symbol has fulfilled its function? Elizabeth, whether real or an impostor, ruled for over 4 decades, defeated the Spanish Armada, and consolidated Anglican supremacy. If a gender secret was hidden at the heart of that epic feat, then modern England was founded on a carefully sustained fraud. But the fraud, if it existed, was also her strength. By cultivating an androgynous image, Elizabeth transcended the categories of woman and man, establishing herself as an almost divine figure. She was neither wife nor mother. She was neither maiden nor virago. She was all of them, and none. That blurring allowed her to position herself outside the social and religious constraints of her time. Ambiguity became a tool of power. No one could reduce her to a single role, and no one could claim authority over her body. The European context made the rumor even more explosive. For Catholics, such a discovery would have been pure gold, proof that English Protestantism was sustained by a monstrous deception. For Protestants, the doubt was inadmissible. Acknowledging it meant undermining the legitimacy of the entire reign. Hence the ironclad silence, hence the lead-sealed coffin, hence the absolute prohibition of exposing her corpse to the public. Ultimately, what is disturbing is not whether the Bisley Boy theory is true or false, but why it remains alive. Perhaps because it reveals a deeper truth, that power does not depend on the flesh, but on belief. Elizabeth was, for 45 years, what England needed her to be: virgin, queen, symbolic mother, warrior, goddess, statue. Man or woman, healthy or sick, real or imposter, her identity was the most effective mask ever worn by a monarch. And perhaps, just like the ceruse that was slowly killing her, that mask was both her glory and her doom. On March 24, 1603, when Elizabeth finally took her last breath, the machinery of the state entered a state of emergency. It was not just about mourning the queen. The crucial thing was deciding what to show and what to hide. The news that the sovereign's body was marked by deformities, ulcers, and rot was unacceptable. Tudor power had built its legitimacy on the uncorrupted image of the Virgin Queen, almost a living sacrament. Exposing the fragility of that flesh was tantamount to desecrating a national altar. Therefore, the Privy Council acted with surgical coldness. Orders were given to embalm the body quickly, seal it in a lead coffin, and avoid public viewing at all costs. No official autopsy, no open wake. The death had to be covered up by lavish rituals, solemn processions, sacred music, and sermons repeating the same message. The queen had departed intact, glorious, and invincible. In reality, the ceremony was a smokescreen. The corpse, hidden beneath layers of cloth, wax, and lead, could no longer sustain the fiction. It was the staging that kept the myth standing. The Anglican clergy understood perfectly what was at stake. England had just survived a century of religious wars, plots, and papal excommunications. If it were disclosed that Elizabeth had died deformed and delirious, Catholic enemies would present it as proof that her reign had been cursed by God. The pulpits of Rome would echo with mockery, and the fragile Protestant unity would totter. Absolute silence was preferable to handing adversaries a celestial argument. That silence became doctrine. Instead of an autopsy, there were litanies. Instead of medical reports, there were panegyrics. The written word was not to record any illness. Collective memory was to remember only majesty. Thus, silence became a political weapon. Because in politics, what is left unsaid weighs more than what is spoken. And in religion, the hidden can transform into dogma. Meanwhile, in the palace corridors, counselors moved with caution. The throne had to pass smoothly to James VI of Scotland, inaugurating the Stuart dynasty. Any shadow cast upon Elizabeth's legitimacy would have weakened that transition. That is why the official version was bulletproofed. The Queen had died in peace after a life of virtue and glory. Everything else had to remain buried, not only beneath the stones of Westminster, but beneath layers of carefully managed silence. That silence functioned as a tacit decree, an unwritten law that transcended generations. What was seen in the death chamber was not told, because telling it would have meant dynamiting the very foundations of the English monarchy. Physical truth was sacrificed in the name of political truth. The body was hidden so that the crown might survive. And so, the lie transformed into ritual, and the ritual into memory. What is disturbing is that this strategy did not die in 1603. In every regime, ancient or modern, the same pattern repeats itself. Power selects what to show and what to silence, which bodies are exposed and which are hidden, which illnesses are named and which become state secrets. Silence, more than the word, is the preferred tool of those who govern. In Elizabeth's case, that silence did not merely protect a corpse. It protected the fiction that held an entire kingdom together. With Elizabeth's death, England lost more than a sovereign. It lost the embodiment of a narrative that had sustained the kingdom for nearly half a century. The Virgin Queen was not just a woman. She was the representation of national identity, the living banner of Protestant supremacy, the marble statue that had defied the Pope and defeated the Spanish Armada. But that myth came at a price, and the corpse hidden in Westminster was the unpaid bill for that fabricated immortality. Official chroniclers insisted that Elizabeth had died glorious, uncorrupted, and undefeated. Processions repeated her image as a warrior goddess, while doctors kept silent about the devastated body they had seen. The people were not to know the truth, that the statue had cracked, that beneath the alabaster mask lay rotting flesh. To admit it would have been to question not only the Queen, but the monarchy itself and the very project of Protestant England. The myth worked because it responded to a collective need. In a Europe torn apart by religious wars, England needed to believe in a pure, almost divine leader. That belief became social cement, the glue that held the nation together. But at the same time, the lie was a poison. Elizabeth's body was sacrificed in silence to maintain the fiction. She herself accepted dying slowly under lead makeup because she understood that without that face, the myth would crumble. The paradox is brutal. The more she sought immortality, the faster she was consumed. Elizabeth was not defeated on the battlefield. She did not fall to a conspirator's dagger. She did not die by a stroke of fate. She died corroded by the obsession with remaining eternal. Vanity, turned into a political strategy, was her cruelest executioner, and that vanity was not personal, but collective. England needed the illusion just as much as the Queen did. The people, the courtiers, the poets, all were accomplices to the mask. Here arises the uncomfortable question: what is more real, the physical body or the memory that remains? If we think about history, Elizabeth lives on as a myth, not as a corpse. The Gloriana sung of in literature is more powerful than the sick woman trembling in her bed. The statue conquered the flesh, but that victory carries an ethical cost. It was built on the denial of truth, on the sacrifice of a person's humanity in favor of a nation's greatness. That logic is not exclusive to the Tudors. Throughout the centuries, every empire has manufactured similar myths. Heroes who never bleed, martyrs who never doubt, leaders who never age. Reality is buried, legend is celebrated. The people need to believe that their rulers are more than human, even if the price is turning them into living statues. Elizabeth accepted that destiny with iron discipline. But in that pact, she lost the most essential thing, the possibility of simply being a woman. In the gloom of Westminster, the myth became a tomb. The statue that had ruled England survived intact in the collective memory, while the real body decayed beneath the stones. And so the price of immortality was sealed, renouncing truth, flesh, and fragility. What England gained in glory, it lost in humanity. And in that dark exchange, the Virgin Queen achieved eternity, but at the cost of disappearing as a human being. Elizabeth's coffin, sealed with lead and covered in royal symbols, was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey with all the pomp the occasion demanded. The people of London, who crowded the streets to watch the procession pass, suspected nothing. To them, the Virgin Queen remained intact, turned into living marble, elevated to the status of an eternal myth. No one could imagine that beneath those layers of velvet and gold lay a devastated, deformed, and ulcerated body, carefully hidden from the public eye. The stones of Westminster kept the secret with stony loyalty. Beneath its Gothic vaults, silence became the custodian of a truth too dangerous to tell. For if it had been revealed that the woman who represented purity and divine strength had died consumed by poisons, diseases, and perhaps an ambiguous identity, the entire political and religious edifice of England would have tottered. The myth had to survive, even if the truth was buried forever. Some later chroniclers hinted in veiled phrases that what was found at Richmond was not to be told. That silence was not a simple omission. It was a pact of state. Admitting reality was tantamount to handing Catholic enemies proof that Elizabeth's reign had been cursed. It was tantamount to confessing that the monarchy, presented as a reflection of divine will, was nothing more than a theater sustained by blood, lead, and fear. Today, more than 4 centuries later, the secret remains buried. No archaeologist dares to desecrate the Queen's sarcophagus, not only out of historical respect, but because opening it would mean unearthing the most corrosive doubts about British national identity. What would happen if modern science confirmed the rumors? Lead poisoning, hidden tumors, sexual anomalies. What would England do with the revelation that its foundational icon was, in reality, a broken and poisoned body? The echo of that question resonates in the gloom of the Abbey. Tourists walk over the flagstones, choirs sing hymns, candles illuminate altars. And beneath it all, the secret still beats, protected by stone and silence. It is as if Elizabeth herself had dictated her last will, that the mask survive, that the statue reign beyond the flesh, that the myth be eternal even if the truth remains buried. Deep down, that is the darkest legacy of the Virgin Queen. She taught the world that some truths are too dangerous to be known, that there are kingdoms that only survive as long as they remain silent, and that the price of political immortality is always the same, sacrificing the humanity of those who embody it. There in the gloom of Westminster, amid the echo of prayers and the cold of the flagstones, Elizabeth's last whisper remains intact, a secret that England decided never to unearth, and perhaps that decision, more than any victory or speech, was her final triumph. Because while the truth dies beneath the stone, the myth lives on, immortal, indestructible.